So thank you, Sally, for coming and just having a chat about how you're using Out the Box in schools and the impact it's having. Do you want to just introduce yourself to start with?
Yes, I'm Sallie Butcher, and I'm the vicar of 6 relatively small churches in the Diocese of Worcester. We're very, very rural, up against the Herefordshire border. I have 2 primary schools based in my benefice, and we use Out of the Box in both of those schools.
Great. And do you want to just give us a flavour of how you're using it? Is it like a 10-minute slot or a half an hour? What are you doing? How are you going in and using it?
Well, predominantly at the moment in the schools, we're using it for collective worship. I was hoping to be able to use godly play, but that doesn't fit to the time slots that you have for a collective worship, and trying to chop godly play down to that slot was very difficult, and I've been struggling with it when Out of the Box suddenly appeared, and it was exactly what we needed to be able to encourage the children to be more reflective, even within their sort of collective worship slot, and it's worked very well. We've also used it in the preschool children, where we're able to do a much longer session, and that's where we're able to put quite a long play session on at the end of the actual storytelling and the normal questions at the end. We were actually able to take it into a little bit of like you tend to do with godly play. So it's been very useful. But we're currently in conversation with both schools about doing longer sessions, but with smaller groups of children, particularly in the younger age group. But I'm also talking to the children that actually lead collective worship themselves, because they're quite interested in having a go doing it themselves, which will be very interesting to see how children actually lead it as well. So that's an exciting thing for the future.
Yeah, we've had others who are saying that the children are becoming the storytellers as well, and holding that space for other children to enter into stories. So if we think about the collective worship first, and then maybe think about the preschool that you're doing. So I'm imagining you're doing it to quite a big group of people. Is how many children are?
Yes, it's changed slightly because of COVID. So initially we were trying to do it, we were doing it online right at the very beginning. So that was, the children were in their individual class groups. The problem with that, we could use it for the storytelling, but it was very difficult to do the questioning at the end with us knowing what was going on. We sort of, in the end, we sort of left it for the individual teachers to do that themselves. Then the next stage was we were allowed to go into school, but they weren't allowing all of the children to be in at the same time. So we were splitting Key Stage 1 with reception and Key Stage 2, and we were doing it to those 2 groups separately. That worked quite well, because it was much easier to be closer to the storytelling, to actually physically have the children closer. We're now into full school collective worship, which means both schools are of similar size, so we're around about the 100 children mark. It is a challenge trying to get the story and get the actual storytelling stuff close enough to the children for them to be able to see it. So we're tending to use a low table so that it's not too high up, but it's high enough up that the children at the front can still see, even though the children that are sitting right at the back can actually see over the heads of the other children. So that is a bit of a challenge, and it is one of the things that we're thinking about, maybe trying to be more in the middle of the children rather than up at the front. That's something that we're having to sort of try and try and work out.
So you share the story, and then the wondering, do you leave them to wander in just in their hearts, or is there verbal wandering?
No, they do verbal wandering with us, and then we also encourage them to go back to the classrooms and carry on the wandering for the rest. They have their one of the schools has their collective worship immediately after lunch, and we ask them to try and carry that wandering through the rest of the afternoon, and to share it with each other, which seems to work quite well. I haven't had the opportunity to have too much feedback from the teachers. They say it works very well, so I imagine that they are doing some more wandering afterwards. But the children all join in. We've particularly been impressed that how the younger children, they seem to find the wandering easier, which I think is, there's a few things going on there. One of them was, as I think quite a few schools found, children who had previously been in school, who had then been taught at home for such a long period, found coming back into school, and in particular coming back into collective worship and being in space with a lot of children, they found it really, really difficult. They actually just found the whole concept of being in this hall with other children quite hard. They found it difficult to settle. They found it difficult to be quiet. Whereas the younger children who'd never had that experience before actually settled much quicker. And they particularly seemed to be pulled into the story much, much easier. And then they found their wandering much easier. They were much, much more prone to wander much more widely, whereas the older ones seem to be more contained. And I think again there was quite a few things going on. There was a little bit of coming back into school and coming back to having more structured lessons in general, and a day that was much more structured. They were wanting to come up with the right answers. And in one particular school, we had a young child who is quite well known within the school for being quite outspoken, and in particular for being not religious at all. And he seemed quite surprised when we were encouraging the children to wonder, that he was wondering outside of what might be thought of as traditional Christian collective worship, which of course I, as a vicar going in to do it, that's what is expected. And the fact that he was coming up with other things, he seemed quite surprised that I was saying, oh yes, that's absolutely fine. And it sort of diffused him somewhat in his usual quite argumentative way. The younger children, as I say, they tend to wonder much more widely. Some of the older children as well, whether it's about coming back together again and about sharing things that are quite personal with people that they haven't been around for a while. And some of the older children do struggle with the notion of talking about any sort of sense of faith. There are a few children who have a faith, and they quite like that they've got the opportunity to talk about it. But most of them keep quite quiet. You don't know what their background is.
But it's an opportunity for people who have a faith, or who have quite strong maybe opinions, anti-faith possibly, that it's all okay.
It's all okay.
It's all right.
They all seem to be quite surprised that it's okay to be sort of to do either,
Yeah.
to be at either end.
Yeah. And I guess for you coming in as what you were talking about, the expectations, maybe it's quite nice to have that tool that it breaks down those expectations.
It is.
Oh gosh, she's the vicar, so what's the right answer? Or, yeah.
Yes, which is something we're just sort of starting to work with the crews, so the children that lead worship. We've just started sort of working with them, starting to think about the fact that not only is there not right or wrong answers, but that that they had done a fairly standard telling of creation, and then they also did one which was about Noah's Ark, and sort of saying, well, that could be a story. The Bible is full of stories. Yes, it has some which are much more based around history, but actually there's a lot of story in there. And the story, and this is one of the things that is why Out of the Box and the wondering part actually fits beautifully into some of the parables, is that a lot of parables that Jesus deliberately leaves things fairly vague, and lets you wonder exactly what the message behind the parable might be. And because Out of the Box fits into that beautifully. So it's a very good way of being able to tell the parables, and it's something that we'd like to be able to do more of. Use the Out of the Box storytelling method to tell the story of some of the parables, because it will. I think that will be a very rich wondering.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the just to explain to the people who are listening, there are different genres in Out of the Box, and the ones that most we've started with using is the wisdom Out of the Box, which are the ones you're talking about. But we've also got arts and nature and STEM and history and religion and worldviews out of the box that you could use for teaching from and about religion. And then we've got the Christian nurture out of the box. So the parables, I mean, all of the Christian parables, as well as Buddhist koans and as well as Midrash stories, could all be used for Out of the Box. And it's, they're just being developed with people like you. So yeah, it's interesting that sort of whole, as for a Christian to think, well, this is the way maybe we should be working with the Bible and with stories in the Bible and with myths and with parables, as ones that we can interrogate our lives and interrogate the stories themselves. Great, yeah. So that's the in the collective worship, how you're using it, and how possibly you could use, because I'm presuming this is a Church of England school, is it? So that you can have a Christian act of worship as well, so that you could actually use Out of the Box Christian stories in that collective worship as well.
Even sometimes we use some of the other stories, and then we can at the end of collective worship, we then make the link into some aspect of Christianity as well, and you can do that with lots of the stories. It's something that I'm very interested in, about using things from other religions to enrich Christianity. It's actually something that has been happening for a long time, but probably most people, particularly people who are not involved with the church, don't think that we ever do that, but actually we actually do quite a lot.
Brilliant. And that's so good, isn't it, for interfaith dialogue? And for children to be involved in that interfaith thinking. It changes things, doesn't it? Changes our communities and possibly the world by interfaith dialogue. And Out of the Box, it does come from Deep Talk, which is a method of dialogue, how we are with each other. So that's great that we can do that with all of our different religious traditions. And then the preschool work
Yep.
that you're doing, do you want to, have you noticed any, or have the teachers noticed any wellbeing impact that's having with the class, or learning outcomes? Or
they're quite surprised just how quiet and peaceful the children are when we're telling the story, and whereas we might go in and do other things with them, with the children, and they tend to, if we're using things, they're always wanting to pick them up. But they seem to be quite happy, whether it's because we let them at the end actually play with the stuff that's there, and I've just started to use my godly play sand rather than just the cloth, because we've come to the point where we feel safer about letting them do that, because they do seem to pick up on the how important the things are, and actually treating them very respectfully, whereas lots of other things they don't, and then they might sort of start throwing things all over the place. But they seem very respectful of them. And some of the children gravitate towards actually using the elements of the story themselves, whereas we've normally got some other sort of craft ideas to be used at the end if they want to. So again, like godly play, where you give the children a range of things to play with at the end, and some gravitate one way and some gravitate the other, but both are equally valuable.
So that time, like you said at the early, you've got a lot longer, so you've got time to do the story and the wondering, and then the response could be play with the story, or do something with their hands, make something, or draw, or whatever. And interesting that you're using the sand as well as the cloth. And in Out of the Box, you can use cloth, you can use sand, or if you're in the woods, you can use the earth. The medium. Well,
that's our next stage, because they do forest. They do forest school. My benefice is called Wyre Forest West, because we are very much half embedded in Wyre Forest. So both schools back onto forest. So the children find it a very natural place for them to be, because they're surrounded by it. So that our next sort of stage is we want to try and do some of these stories, but actually out in their forest school area, because we think that would work. We think that will work very well to sort of meet the two together.
That's great. And with these sort of, I don't know if you wanted to share anything about how the children are playing in the sand or with the cloth, with you notice that the objects are important and they're drawn to the objects. Is there anything about how they're playing that you've noticed? What are they doing with the things?
Well, they're sort of telling the story their way, but they're also in some cases taking it off into their lives and things that are happening to them, and sort of molding them together somehow, sort of blending. I think blending is the right sort of word, blending the story that they've been told with their own lives, and telling their own stories, really, which in an area which is very it's not very diverse at all. I think that's quite important, that some of these other stories that we're able to bring into them lead them into things that they don't normally come across in day-to-day stuff. Because seeing people of other ethnicities and things like that for them is very unusual, because that's not where they live. And
how does, sorry to interrupt, but how does the Out of the Box stories help them to widen their experience of things?
Some of the stories are are very much about difference, about different groups, different types of people, and how you treat people of different types, which for them, when everything is actually quite similar, it gives them the chance to sort of play around with that. And it's something that has to be in schools and preschools. In an area which is not very diverse, you have to do it very, very deliberately, because otherwise they won't have that opportunity. And when they go out into the big wide world, it's something that they haven't been used to up until that. So it is something that the teachers do actively have to do something about, and we do find ourselves regularly, both in considering the teaching of RE, which of course brings in the other faith groups as well. Sometimes we have to very carefully think about how we're actually going to do that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Hadn't thought through that at all, actually. With Out of the Box. Yeah, where children aren't coming across difference, and it's bringing that into in a safe place where they can play with those ideas. Yeah. Great. Yeah, thank you. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention in terms of what you've been noticing?
The only other particular thing that we had noticed was one particular child with special needs who normally is quite agitated during collective worship. I think a lot of it is to do with noise. In both schools, the halls in which they do collective worship are quite, compared to the rest of their classrooms, which in small village schools, the classrooms are small and they tend to have low ceilings, whereas they go into a hall which has a big high ceiling and it's very echoey. And children, particularly autistic children, find that noise quite difficult. And one child, prior to doing some of the Out of the Box stories, was always having to wear ear protectors to try and deaden the noise down a bit. But I've noticed recently he's coming in and he's not needing to do that. And he particularly, what I tend to do, which is slightly different in collective worship, particularly when the children are much further away, I don't put everything away at the end before the children leave. I leave the story out on the table and encourage the children as they're leaving the hall to walk past the table so they can see much closer. And he just seems absolutely mesmerized by what's there. And it's one of the things I'm going to have to organize a meeting with his TA, his teaching assistant, because he is obviously really being sucked into the story, and he tends to stand there and he just stares at the things, and he almost has to be dragged out of the hall, kicking and screaming almost. He's not, but trying to drag him out because he obviously wants to carry on standing and looking at it. And I think it'd be very interesting perhaps to do even almost one-to-one session with him after everybody else to see where he's going with that. It seems to be something that enables him to still himself down and be quiet, which of course autistic children sometimes find that quite a challenge. So I think it is going to be very interesting to look at the use of Out of the Box with children with special needs, because I think it's going to be quite a fruitful area of development.
Yeah, thank you. And we actually we have got some people working one-to-one with children in special schools actually, and some of what you're saying there really resonates with what they're finding, and others who are using it in a whole class but then taking it with small groups and then take it one-to-one, just according to children's needs really. And so I hope that can can occur more and more in your school, really.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sallie. That's been really, it's a real pleasure to hear how it's being used and how you're adapting it and using it in different ways in the school, including in collective worship. So thank you very much.
Thank you.